Hello, hello. So it's hard now. We're stuck inside. I'm lucky enough to have a garden. It's a lovely day. So for those of you who don't have a garden and are only allowed out once a day, my heart goes out. I'm unlucky enough to have three children who are being quite noisy, but also lucky enough to have their company. So I'm doing all right. But my question for today is how do we progress as performers when we don't have a space to perform? What can we do to keep moving forward? Because as singers we sing, as performers we perform, and many can't find the space to sing as they might. Even if you can sing at home, there may be times and limits to how much you can sing and what's going on in your house. And my children, I know, limit my singing because they get fed up with me singing all the time. I don't blame them. And I've heard of singers singing in the bathroom to get the right acoustic and recording in there. Some singers have gone online and are doing a lot more online, which is brilliant. The reality is, though, our performance spaces are now restricted and we don't have the opportunity to sing, and even our opportunities to learn are restricted. But even though you're not performing, you can still work on who you are as a performer, reducing your nerves and developing a healthy mindset, a healthy attitude, building in some resilience in what you're doing. Because let's face it, the biggest cause of nerves for most people is about worrying what people are going to think. It's about judgment of our audience, judgment of the people out there we're performing to, whether that's an audition panel, a village hall full of people, or the Albert Hall. We worry about their judgment and we worry about what people will think of us. And that may seem obvious to say, but I think it is worth saying. And as we go along, it will become clearer as to why I say it's worth saying that. And even further than that, many people worry that if they stop worrying, they won't work as hard and they won't achieve as much as they possibly already achieved. And some of you may have heard me already quote one of my clients who said she worries that if she stops worrying, she won't be as good. And that is often what holds us back. We think this worrying about what other people think is what's driving us forward, and we would drop our standards if we thought differently. And the truth is, we're never going to stop thinking about what the audience is going to think. We're never going to stop considering the audience and their opinion and their judgment of us. What we can do is stop obsessing about it. As Nancy Kline, who wrote, well, I've read two of her books. I'm reading the second one. The first book is Time to Think. It's a fabulous book. And the second one is inventively called More Time to Think. And in More Time to Think, she talks about the idea that if we're always thinking about what other people are thinking, then we're not thinking. We're not thinking for ourselves. And you'll find that you may have found this on stage. If we're constantly obsessing about what the audience is thinking of us, then you can't think straight. Your head is cluttered. It's all full of those, oh, did they react that? How did they find that? What's going on? What did they think of this? And it's full of judgment, critical judgment. And then if you make a mistake, you become obsessed with that mistake and not wanting to do it again and how to control it and how to deal with it. And your head is then filled with all these worries about what everyone's going to think, and often critical judgment of yourself to try and protect yourself from what everyone's going to think, protect yourself from their critical judgment. And the irony is, the less you care, the freer your voice, the freer your performance. So how do we get that balance between that freedom, the freedom we get when we don't care? I sometimes compare it to when you're singing, when you've had a glass of wine or two, you're not thinking about everything. And sometimes I would find that my voice sounded, perhaps that was just the wine talking, but my voice felt freer because I wasn't caring. But how do we get that balance between that sense of not caring, but also putting in the work that we all know is important to put in to achieve the sort of standard that we want to achieve? Now, next time I will talk about how you can do this actually in your practice, in the singing. But I promised something that you could do at home without singing. So in that space where you are not able to sing, when you're restricted. And so something you can do without making a sound. And the one thing I want to talk to you about today then that you can do is to explore your fear. Now, I said when we talked about the fear of the audience's negative judgment, that may seem obvious. It may seem obvious. However, and that's universal, the fear of other people's judgment. There isn't a person out there who takes their work seriously and doesn't think about what their audience thinks of them. I've got lost in my own thoughts. So it's universal. So the overarching fear is universal. However, the triggers for that fear, the underlying motivations, are all either significantly different or subtly different for everyone. And understanding that fear and actually going into that fear is something we often resist doing. Unsurprisingly, because it doesn't feel a nice place to go. And often we've been taught, just pull your socks up and get on with it, or don't worry about it, it'll be fine. Sort of a rather dismissive attitude to that fear. And actually, what really helps is going and looking at our fear. So whether or not our fear seems like an obvious fear, well, it was because my music teacher said I couldn't sing when I was 7. It's because you may have an idea of where it was triggered and you may go, well, it's really obvious, I've got that sorted. But if it's still hanging around with you, chances are you've not really got to into the nitty-gritty of it. So if you can take some time to properly explore what it is you're afraid of their judgment, what is it about their judgment that makes you afraid, what are you really worried about, and where does that fear come from? And really start to talk about it with yourself and write it down and make notes, and then think about how reasonable or unreasonable that fear is, because sometimes we call ourselves stupid for being worried. But another client I spoke to talked about being afraid of going on stage and singing in gigs. And we talked about the idea, and she talked about this idea that she didn't want anyone to see that she was nervous. But everyone gets nervous. Everyone who takes their work seriously gets nervous about going in front of an audience. So it's not unreasonable for her to be afraid of singing at her gigs or nervous. It's about the level of those nerves. And she'd got herself into this vicious cycle of being so worried about looking nervous that she'd created the nerves. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, that sort of idea. And the idea that actually being afraid was a perfectly reasonable place to be actually then reduced her nerves, because if it's reasonable to be worried about that and people see that you're slightly nervous, then it's no biggie. And that goes along the lines of what's the worst that can happen. So if you dig into your fear, ask yourself, is it reasonable to have that fear? And maybe you'll discover that it isn't reasonable to have that fear. It doesn't seem to make sense when you say it out loud. Sometimes when we hide from our fear, we don't have the opportunity to discover that it's an irrational fear. I'll tell you, embarrassingly enough, about my irrational fear. I was food phobic for many years and still have elements of that. And I was terrified of apples. And I never really dealt with it until I suddenly went, I'm terrified of apples. I always just said I didn't like them. But actually to say I'm terrified of apples, I suddenly went, oh, that's a proper phobia. That's proper irrational. Yes, it's definitely what I feel, but that's not a rational fear to have. So that idea that it was an irrational fear, suddenly the whole food thing felt less daunting, because I realized that it was something I'd got myself wound up in, and I could let it go. And you can ask yourself, do other people feel this way? As with the client who was talking about nerves, do other people feel this way? When you go in front of an audition panel, do other people feel nervous? Yes, they do. So this is perfectly reasonable and a rational place to be. And then maybe you can offer yourself some empathy, some kindness, and let yourself relax into it. So my challenge for you today is to take a real look at your fear and what's going on for you and what's underlying. What's the real fear when you get up in front of an audience and you're fearing their judgment? Yes. What's that about? And if you can start to answer that in your head, then that will start to ease your nerves, because you can then start to have a strategy as to how to deal with it. So next time I will talk about something you can do within your practice, even if it's in your own house, to develop yourself as a singer whilst we don't have these opportunities to perform. And we all love to perform as singers. We all love to get out there, even though we get nervous sometimes. And so it's so hard when we don't have these opportunities. Again, I'll say, if there's anything particular you want me to cover in any one of these sessions, then just send me a message, put it in the comment box, whatever you need to. I hope you're all doing really well out there, despite the circumstances, and I wish you all the best. See you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.